really fascinated to know why you think this is the last book. When I think of all the books you've written, and they have influenced me, why would you say this is going to be my last book?
Well, I'm about to retire from Oxford University, and I've loved writing books, and I've written lots of books. But I do feel that you quit when you're ahead, and I think that I've decided that this will be the last book I write. I will revise older books as necessary, and I want to concentrate more on developing podcasts and short video presentations, because I feel those might be, first of all, easier to produce, but secondly, actually might be more accessible and useful for people. So books, wonderful, but there are other ways of communicating, and I hope I'll be able to do that in the future as well.
When you wrote this book, as I was reading it, I was wondering, who did you have in mind for the book? Because I read it and I thought, gosh, if I was a Dawkins disciple, this would fascinate me. If I was a Christian who would be somewhat uncertain of their faith in the sort of Charles Taylor, highly secular bubble we live in. And then there are sort of people who just want to know whether we have a reasonable faith. But then who did you have in mind? Did you have a single audience in mind?
I think I had a number of audiences in mind, although this is just the story of me. I mean, and it does impact a number of audiences. And I think in many ways, one very important audience is those who would have shared my views about science, about religious faith when I was 16. And I'm saying to you, look, you know, I understand where you're coming from. I used to be there, but I didn't stay there. I want you to stay with me and listen to my thinking as I explain why I moved away from that. So in many ways, this might be a book that could be helpful to somebody, for example, who is thinking about these things, or indeed to a parent who has a 16-year-old child who's thinking along these lines and wants to say, well, look, here's somebody who isn't 16 anymore. That was a long time ago, you know. But here's how he changed his mind. Might that help you? But the other audience is simply ordinary Christians who are asking questions like, how do I make sense of my faith? How do I figure out what I'm meant to be doing in life? And I give my answers to those questions, not because my answers are right, but because they might be helpful in stimulating people to think. So this is very much a book which is saying, look, this is me, take it or leave it. But actually, I think you may find this helpful to you as you think about these same questions.
Fabulous, thank you. Allow me then to dig into the contents of the book a little bit. You call yourself a nature-loving schoolboy Marxist at some point, and I was fascinated because as I was reading this, I was thinking something of the journey that C.S. Lewis went along. And as he reflected on a similar sort of start in his worldview, there were just certain things as a Marxist that he couldn't think about, or at least as a secularist, he just couldn't think about certain things. It was just strictly beyond the pale. And I wondered if you can recall as a Marxist, there were some ideas that were just beyond the pale, or did you just feel you lived on a different planet and those ideas, just that concept, that worldview just never came to you, it just wasn't considered?
I think Lewis never really embraced Marxism, although you're right, he did embrace a form of secularism. When I was a Marxist, I took it very seriously. One of the reasons that I took Marxism seriously was that it was very trendy. Lots of people thought it was good, and I tended to go with the flow at that stage. But also, I could see that offered me what I would now call a big picture. In other words, it wasn't just it explains that. It's actually, it gives you a big picture that explains everything. And I found that very attractive. And of course, the danger of that is that some things are rather forced. And I found myself overlooking those on purpose. I felt that, for example, it was very, very clear to me that Marxism had some difficulties, and it was pointed out to me by Marxist friends. Well, of course, that was how Stalin interpreted Marxism. It wasn't really like that. We need to go back to Marx rather than Stalin. So in effect, there was almost like a sort of inbuilt layer of apologetics within Marxism, which said, well, look, you know, where it seems to struggle, well, that's because people have misunderstood it. And so there was, if you like, an awareness that there were problems and an attempt almost to explain those away.
You talk about this sort of transition moment of realizing there's a certain uncertainty in belief. And I guess I'm thinking, if you were in an audience where there were both Christians who were somewhat stunned that you as a Christian would even say that, and then scientists who would be absolutely puzzled by what you meant by that, how would you unpack that concept of we all live with a certain uncertainty of belief?
I think I begin by explaining how I came to appreciate this dilemma, and it was when I was an atheist. Because obviously, one of the questions I was asking myself, though not perhaps with the intensity that I ought to have asked myself, is what actually is the evidential basis for atheism? And as you know, it isn't really very good. And yet I believed there was no God. And as I thought about it, I began to realize that actually I believed there is no God, but I could not prove that. And not only that, but nobody else could either. And therefore, I came to this reluctant but actually decisive realization that atheism was a faith. Atheism believes there is no God. It can't prove that. So it opened my way of thinking to something which I think is rather important, which is maybe there are other ways of thinking that are also not provable, but might actually have better intellectual credentials and better outcomes than atheism. So that I think was very important for me, because it made me realize that actually, why was I expecting that anything had to be proven with complete certainty? And again, as a scientist, that even at the age of 16, I was becoming aware that, science did change its mind on some things. So actually, there is this real issue about science proving things, because it's a matter of interpretation. There are certain observations which might be interpreted this way today, but that way tomorrow, and we don't quite know what they are.
While we're on that subject of you starting to think of other things, you mentioned Nietzsche's warning about strong people don't need these metaphysical comforts. That, as I read it, I thought that didn't sound as if it was a high barrier for you to climb. That was not something that you thought, I'm sorry, but if Nietzsche says I can't go there, I can't go there. Where did that, what part did Nietzsche play in that? Was it not a significant warning for you? It obviously didn't appear to be one.
I think I like to think of myself as being a strong person. And therefore, Nietzsche's words didn't really strike me as being terribly intellectually robust. But they did, in effect, say to me, look, if you are strong, you don't need to worry about these things. So be strong. I quite like that. I mean, a critic of me might say, well, you ought to have been a bit more critical about that. And they're right. But at the time, this was what I wanted to hear. I wanted to be told I was strong and bold and taking a position which was a matter of intellectual courage. And I was quite happy to leave it there. I mean, what I should have said is, well, let's just come back to that question. Why? What is the evidence for this position? And of course, I just didn't follow that through.
Fair enough. You mentioned Dawkins and his these sort of truth hecklers, people who say that sort of science has certain provisional knowledge. How would you respond to a Dawkins disciple who just says this is just truth heckling? This is people who are not willing to sit down with solid evidence and stick within solid evidence and no more.
I would say that what Karl Popper is saying, and this is what Dawkins dismisses as truth heckling, is in effect a sophisticated, intelligent, and critical evaluation of a naive approach to the natural sciences. In effect, those who reject Popper are simply saying we refuse to think about this. We simply want to remain with a simple faith, which in effect is that science tells us exactly what is right. And Popper is saying it doesn't. It's not that simple. There's a process of evaluation, of interpretation that has to take place. And this means that science may change its mind on certain things. And its conclusions, therefore, are tentative and provisional. Now, if Popper is wrong on that, he needs to be challenged. But the problem is that Dawkins is saying, don't listen to him. Well, I mean, we must listen to him, because if he's wrong, we can show that. If he's right, it's the end of Dawkins' simplistic take on science. And I'm afraid it's that second option. If Popper is right, and I think he is, Dawkins is simply wrong.
You mentioned Einstein in your book, giving you of all the names, he gave you this bridge that simply said science is not enough. Could you unpack that a little bit? That I thought was quite fascinating.
When I went to Oxford to study chemistry, the first year of the chemistry course allowed me to concentrate on quantum theory. And there are a number of key people who I had to study. Einstein was one of them, and I read him more intensely than I probably ought to have, but he was very interesting. I think what I found very attractive about Einstein was his recognition that there was science, there was politics, there was ethics, there was religion, and they're all different. But Einstein's point is that to be a meaningful human being, to live a meaningful life, you need all of these in various ways. And the fact that they are different does not make them incompatible. The question is, how do we weave them together into what Einstein calls a Weltbild, a coherent picture of reality? And I find that very exciting because Einstein, after all, was the 20th century's best known scientist. He's brilliant. And yet he's saying, look, science isn't enough. And he makes this point multiple occasions. For example, one very famous lecture at Princeton in 1939, he said that science can really only tell us how things hang together, you know, how things are connected with each other. It cannot deal with values or meaning. And yet for us, values and meaning are really very important. And so that, in effect, made me realize that, in effect, science on its own is inadequate. It's not bad, not wrong. It says some very good things, but we need more than that if we're going to actually live our meaningful lives. So for me, Einstein gave me a kind of intellectual framework to start thinking about this relation of science and faith. Now, all Einstein did was, in fact, to say we need them both. And we hold them together somehow. He didn't tell me how to hold them together, but nevertheless, that was very useful.
Thank you. You mentioned this lovely idea, at least it sort of gripped me, that Christ led you out of Plato's cave into a bigger and better world. I wonder if you could, for this sort of a more scientific audience who are saying, so what do you mean by a bigger, better world that Christ led you out into?
I think if I were to restrict myself to a world that is disclosed only by the scientific method, it would be a universe of functionality, by which I mean this is the way in which nature works. Here are the processes in nature. Here are the connections within nature which help us to understand how it functions. But there's something about human nature that makes us ask deeper questions like, why am I here? What am I meant to be doing? What is good? How do I live the good life? What is the meaning of life? These are what Karl Popper calls ultimate questions. And by that, Popper means something that science isn't able to answer. Now, the point I'm going to make is, I think, quite important, and it's basically this. What I'm saying is, imagine there is a big picture of life. Science fills in part of that picture, and that is wonderful. But if you take the kind of approach Richard Dawkins takes, which is to say, there's science and there is nothing else is reliable, then in effect, the rest is blank. What I'm saying is there is science, and it's science. It's not anything else. But there are other forms of human knowledge. For me, science defines what is scientific knowledge. There are other forms of knowledge, and those help fill in that big picture. So the point I'm making is that I need a bigger picture of life than science is able to offer. And because I understand how science functions, science is not intended to answer these ultimate questions. That's not what scientific method does. Therefore, we need to use other intellectual tools to deal with questions like value and meaning. In other words, to be authentic human beings.
Lovely. In the process, going back to now a more sort of general book question, the process of reflecting on your own journey in life and then writing it all out, did it deepen or change or alter or reevaluate some of the thoughts you had about life and convictions? Did it change anything, or was it simply a matter of confirming what you already understood?
I think it helped me to understand how we change our minds over time. But the thing which I had not realized really until I wrote that book is the extent to which my own ideas have been shaped by other people. And in fact, in the book, I take great care to say, I read this person, or I spoke to this person, or I heard this person speak, and I took that idea on board. And one of the points I'm making is that actually, in the Christian life, for example, all of us have our own individual concept of faith, our way of understanding it. We live our lives out, but as we think about it, we realize how influential other people are in our walk of faith. And so, for example, in the book, I reference a sermon I heard, I reference a book I read, I reference a conversation I had. All of these helped me think things through and live out the Christian life. And so, if you like, it's almost like a reflection on Paul's idea of the body of Christ. Actually, we are helped by other people. I'm sure I've helped some people, but as the book makes absolutely clear, I've been helped by lots of other people.
Yes.
And that seems to be part of the Christian life. I'm sure everyone listening to this could, in effect, reflect on their lives and say, actually, I can point to about 6 different people who really influenced me, and I'm grateful for that. And that's what this book is doing. If you like, it's a recognition of the extent to which I have been helped and encouraged and shaped by other people, some of whom will never know the impact they've had on me.
I was wondering, when someone's finished this book, what are you hoping that they will reflect upon? What do you hope? How do you hope they'll respond as they read about your journey?
Obviously, in writing this book, I've handed it over to my readers, and what they do is very much up to them. I think there are 3 outcomes I would hope for, although of course, you know, this may just be me as an author laying down what I shouldn't lay down. But first of all, I think it does indicate how very often people, particularly young people, go for simplistic answers to complicated questions. I did that. I can now see I did that, and I can see how I broke free from that. It's what sociologists call the lure of the simplistic. In other words, you buy into something because it's dead easy. That's what I see in Richard Dawkins. His view of life is simply simplistic. It's not simple, you know, it is simplistic, it is superficial. And I think that what I'm saying to my readers is, look, I went deeper. I'm very glad I did. I think from reading this book, you can see basically why I chose to do that and where it led me. See where it takes you. Secondly, I think this is a very important point, is that many Christians are uncertain about their faith. They don't really understand it properly, and they also are anxious because they cannot prove their core beliefs. I try to speak to them in 2 ways. Number one, here's why we believe in doctrine of the Trinity. No one told me, I figured it out. Does my approach help you? I talk about some debates and conversations I had, and again, you know, I'm saying, is this of any interest to you? It helped me, does it help you? But secondly, I'm also saying, and this explains the title of the book, Through a Glass Darkly, we cannot hope to achieve certainty about core beliefs, about things that really matter. I can prove to you that 2 and 2 make 4, but you know, you're going to look at me and say, well, so what? Makes no difference to anyone. And the key point is, beliefs that change our lives can't be proved. And that's true of Richard Dawkins' atheism that he discovered, I think, rather to his embarrassment in a debate with Rowan Williams at Oxford in 2012. But the point I'm trying to do is to reassure people, you know, we can't expect to prove these things, but we can live by them because we know they're right. We know in our hearts, not just in our minds, and we don't need to worry about that too much. And the third thing is really a very simple point, which is basically, as I was saying earlier, we grow in our faith by listening and reading others. That actually others help us along our way. If you like, it's like you know, a long journey where we cling to other people for comfort. We have conversations with people as we walk along the road of faith, and they help us, they enrich us, they share insights, and maybe we can help them as well. So it's all about this vision of the wandering people of God who help each other as we journey.
Amen. When we talk about looking through a glass darkly, do you think, as a matter of interest, that in a new heaven and a new earth, we will finally be fully known, and learning will stop? Or do you think it's a process that we'll take with us into eternity?
I think we will see face to face. And I think that that will be so wonderful that it will kind of way satisfy us. I think in the book I emphasize, the complexity of our world, including God, and the limits placed on our capacity to understand, and just say we have to learn to live with these. And the limiting condition of being human is a real problem. One day that's going to be removed. So if you like, we reason under limits here, but one day that won't be the case anymore.
Right. Allow me to ask you two questions that has particular interest for our audience, which would be preachers, teachers within the local setting. If a preacher or a teacher was to say, how does this going to affect my preaching style? How does this help me as I speak or teach within a highly secular culture? How would you respond to them?
The first thing I want to say is how much I've been helped by preachers down the ages. And in the book, in fact, I mentioned one in particular, Charles Coulson, who was a Methodist lay preacher, also Oxford's professor of theoretical chemistry, who unexpectedly gave me the framework to hold science and faith together. And it stayed with me ever since. And that was 50 years ago. That's very, very important. So in effect, you're planting seeds that may stay and grow. That's very important. I think the main thing I want to say to preachers is, you have, I think, two very critical roles: to inform, to encourage. And when I say inform, I don't mean this is right, this is how it goes. It's much more, here's what I have found helpful. Can you see the difference it makes? Can I lay out before you something that's really helped me in case it helps you as well? I've been helped by sermons like that, in which a preacher has carefully thought something through, helped me to grasp it, if you like, almost like it's turning on a light. So I see something I hadn't seen before. And once you see it, you don't forget it. The other thing, of course, is to encourage people. And that, I think, is very important, because many times people do feel this sense of, I can't do this, or, this is just too much to ask of me. And again, a preacher is not simply one who educates, but who inspires, who says, look, we can all do this together. We can go further. We can really do this. Think about this. I think that is important, particularly in thinking about vocation. Now, this is a theme that's there in the book, which is, who am I? What am I meant to be doing? How do I kind of live out my life as a Christian? And preachers can help with that. They can talk about their own stories, about how they discovered their vocation. They can bring in someone else to talk about that. But basically, it's so important because people are genuinely asking, what can I do to make a difference? From the book, it's very clear that I've done multiple things at different times. And actually, when I look at those, they join up to make a coherent narrative, even though at the time they didn't look as if they did. So I think that's very important. The office of preacher is so important. And I do want to encourage and affirm all those who are listening to this.
Dr. McGrath, one of the themes that comes out of your book is confidence to think. One of you could explain to a watching audience, why do you think it is so important to think?
I'm very impressed by Christ's command to us to love God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind, and with all our strength. And so, in a sense, we are being asked, almost ordered, to think about our faith. And I think there are two reasons why this is so important. Number one is it means we in effect know what we believe and why we believe it. I think that is very important, because there are many Christians who will say, well, I heard this or I read this, and so I ought to believe this, but they have not thought it through. If they were challenged, they could simply say, I don't know why I believe that. What I want to do in this book is to reassure people this makes sense. And actually, by exploring our faith, we grow in our faith. But more importantly, as the rise of the new atheism, people like Richard Dawkins has made clear, there are a lot of Christians who don't think about their faith. And I want to say there are very good answers to the questions people ask about faith. We need to know those answers, partly because it's good for us, but it's also good for those we talk to. It's a way in which we can, in effect, help people to grasp why the Christian faith is so exciting, so wonderful, and being able to say, here's a way of thinking about this, or I found this helpful, actually can be the gateway to somebody beginning to think seriously about the Christian faith. So for me, it's important to think about our faith, because it in fact is good for us, but also good for those we're going to be talking to.
Fascinating man, Dr. McGrath. I recommend getting hold of his book, Through a Glass Darkly, coming out on the 3rd of September. By the time you watch this, it would have already come out, by Hodder and Stoughton. Truly a fascinating read of a man who went through quite a significant transition in his life into what he calls a bigger, better world. If you want to know anything more about the organization, LWPT, Leaders of Worship and Preachers Trust, please do contact us on our website, wpt.org, and find out more about the organization, how you can be involved, and if you're a church leader who wants to be better equipped for preaching, teaching, and the assets to make that happen, please do let us know. We'd be happy to contact you.